At the time, like the neighborhood that I lived in, it was a predominantly white neighborhood. We were the second black family to move into that neighborhood. Also coincided with Detroit as a whole declining in terms of like disinvestment in the city. I thought I was losing my sight, and I didn't know why. My birth mother had actually three other children before I had a family member who came out as a lesbian. A lot of the anti-gay and like the homophobia, transphobia and stuff like that within evangelicalism, it was never compatible with me as like being an empathetic person. But then there was also like the feelings came back, and it was like, and I actually started to feel feelings that I hadn't really like allowed myself to feel. I specifically focused on white evangelical Christians. If this is like the fruit that this belief system brings forth, then I don't want any part of that.
And as promised in the teaser, today we have a giveaway. The signed copies of Jaye's book for you guys. The only thing that you have to do is to comment on the episode, subscribe to the channel, and follow Jaye on Instagram. And now, enjoy the episode. Hi, Jaye, and thank you for accepting the invite.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me.
Today I'm joined in the Whereabouts Tales by Jaye Pool, self-published author and creator of the Losantiverse. Have I said it right?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. That it took me a while to think how to pronounce it, but I managed. I managed. I'm happy that I managed it from the first try. The first book of the Losantiverse was launched on the 4th of March, called Make Me Free. The second is about to come out in, I think, around about 2 weeks, if I discover it correctly.
Yes, May 6th.
May 6th, exactly. To Die is Gain. Today we're discussing with Jane about writing as healing, about faith deconstruction, and what it means to find your voice after a loss. Jaye, I've been really looking forward to this after I've done the investigation or the research for this episode. Thank you again for being here.
Well, again, thanks for having me. I'm looking forward to us having conversation.
That's cool. Let's start with the beginning, Jane. You grew up in Detroit, if my information was correct. What was life growing up in Detroit?
So, growing up in Detroit, my family and I, I was born in Detroit, but then I lived in other parts of the United States from the time I was 2 until I was 8.
Mm-hmm.
But then once my family and I moved back to Detroit when I was 8, we lived on the far east side of Detroit. And at the time, like the neighborhood that I lived in, it was a predominantly white neighborhood. We were the second black family to move into that neighborhood.
Oh, okay.
And over time, like the neighborhood changed a lot. Like basically, a lot of our neighbors moved out. We ended up with like newer neighbors who were black, and then on top of that, that also coincided with Detroit as a whole declining in terms of like disinvestment in the city, and a lot of like white flight, just yeah. So it was like, so I grew up seeing a lot of changes within the city. So this was so to give you a timeline, this was like during the 1990s.
Mm-hmm. we all knew, at least from Europe, we all knew that Detroit was the heart of the auto production in the US, at least early 90s or late 80s, early 90s.
Yeah. And growing up there, a lot of the people that I knew, like our parents, like all of our parents either were in the auto industry, like either directly or indirectly.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, my father was a psychologist and for a time he worked for companies that were contracted with the big three automakers.
Mm-hmm.
And like he would help provide services that had to do with like drug counseling
Mm-hmm.
and like other like mental health counseling.
Mm-hmm. But still nearby the auto industry, to say it like this.
Right. Like, yeah, that was like, so he was seeing like auto workers. And so, you know, basically, if you were like, so growing up there, like, yeah, basically our parents, like, yeah, they were either working for him or like they were doing something that serviced the auto industry.
Mm-hmm.
So that was a really, like, so the car industry was a huge deal in Detroit. And then, with like NAFTA, like
Mm-hmm.
in the mid 90s, a lot of those jobs began to go away. And with that, a lot of the tax base and, so I grew up with, those types of changes. There was a period of time when my dad was unemployed, and so that was a struggle. And then seeing the neighborhood decline to go from being, pretty like kind of, I guess, middle to working class type of
Mm-hmm.
neighborhood. And like going from that to it being more like run down, more dangerous. I remember when I was a senior in high school and we went for this like school event like during the day, and then we came home and our house had been broken into.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. And so just seeing the changes over time, it had an effect.
It's a yeah. Being the most important employer or employing industry, it makes sense that they had a huge effect on the city. That makes a lot of sense. But did you had the feeling of a? I think I said this in one of the previous episodes, but we know, at least from Europe, from the movies, I know that you have this feeling of a family in the neighborhoods. Have you had that as growing up in Detroit?
Um, I knew people who did. For me, I didn't feel as much connection, but I think a lot of it was because, so my father was, like in particular, well, both my parents, but especially my father, like he was basically a helicopter parent before helicopter parents were a thing. And so like he was just very like distrustful of strangers, very like, okay, we didn't have babysitters. We could only go so far down the street. Like he was just very suspicious of people.
Hmm.
And so I knew people who had those connections within the neighborhood. Like I grew up with I have a friend that I'm still a really good friend that I'm still friends with to this day. She lived like a few blocks over, and she grew up with having all these connections with neighbors, and like the whole like village, the like a takes a village to raise a child and
Hmm.
things like that. And so that existed. It just didn't for me because of the nature of my family and, how my parents were.
Understood, understood. So it was somehow there, but you didn't felt it because of the overprotectiveness,
Yeah.
if you allow me to call it like this. Um, have you have you had an have you ever had the feeling that you were alone, like lonely as growing up?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I felt really like awkward as a child.
Mm-hmm.
Like it was hard for me to fit in anywhere. So so I grew up in mainly like Catholic schools.
Mm-hmm.
And so and when I first going to school, this basically so I had a hard time with like basically like being able to relate to the other kids, that kind of thing. And I didn't really like, so I didn't really kind of have a group until, to some degree, until high school, but really I didn't come into my own until college.
Okay.
Mhm.
Were there early moments when you felt alone? Did you end up feeding them with a kind of a creativity and storytelling in your head from back then, or was something that came up later?
I started writing. So when I was younger, I started out with song lyrics.
Mm-hmm.
So like I had no like I had no musical ability, but I would have tunes in my head and I would just write. It was almost like poems.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just, write these little poems, like just getting out my feelings. And then when I was a teenager, I began to write a novel, which is funny because like the nowadays we would call it hockey romance.
Mm-hmm.
Like so, but like this was before like hockey romance was really a thing. And at the time I was really obsessed with watching ice hockey.
Mm-hmm.
And so like and I grew up where like in Detroit, that was when the Detroit Red Wings first started to become really really like a huge force like in the NHL. Like they went from being like not very good to winning a lot of championships. And so I grew up watching that, and I was like obsessed. Like that was my special interest. So like I knew the stats. I knew like what every player did, like all like the goals and assists and all that. Like so I had all that in my head. And at the same time, you know, like becoming like, going from like a girl to a woman and becoming an adult, a lot of my first like celebrity crushes were hockey players. So I wrote a story about a girl who falls in love with a hockey player. And actually, the funny thing is that the name of the main character from that book, which that book is like lost to time, like just, with like life and, technology and all that. But the main character from that book, actually, I got that name is where I got the name of the main character from Make Me Free.
Ah, okay. Okay,
Mhm.
that's interesting. So somehow it got lost as a story, but it stayed there by keeping Anne's name.
Yes.
Um, you mentioned lyrics, and I did avoid until now, but I have to say it now. You're coming from Detroit, so there is a predictability for music there, right? So did you often get the question if you know him, or
Oh, like you're talking about Eminem? N Yeah, didn't know Eminem, but like I mean, I've had like people ask me about A Mile
of
all the
course,
time.
of
Yeah,
course.
but my first big concert was like the Warped Tour.
Hmm.
And that year, like the year that I went, it was like 1999, and Eminem was the headliner. So I did see him in concert, like for like it was like my first big like concert that I went to, like myself and a friend of mine, and we were out there all day, and we were watching some of the other bands, and we were just like waiting for them. And it was a fun concert. Like we got caught in a mosh pit, almost got trampled, but it was fun.
Like
It was
normal
fun.
event, normal event. My the first concert that I've seen, like the first real concert that I've seen, but not live in the TVs, was the Up in Smoke tour from Eminem, Dr. Dre, and Snoop Dogg. I think
Oh,
that
okay.
was
Yeah.
2001 after Still Dre, so the albums of Dr. Dre was out. But good memories, I have to say, good, nice memories. And Detroit, I think it has a piece of his fame from Eminem. That's at
Mhm.
least my feeling. But
Yeah.
yeah, coming back to the serious topic. I'm sorry for this excursus, but as you said,
Oh, no,
coming
it's
out,
fun. Fun
coming.
to talk about. No, no, yeah, no reason to apologize.
um, were there any specific books, shows, or people that inspired you to start writing besides hockey? Because I understood the passion for hockey and somehow the love story from there, but the style was somehow inspired from some places.
So. as far as the style goes, like a lot of that didn't like so some of the I guess the inspiration to write came later. Like as far
Okay.
as like this story, because what happened was like I did write as a child, but then I went away to college. I moved from Detroit to Columbus because I went to Ohio State. And like because I was in school, like a lot of the writing just kind of fell away. And then I moved down to Cincinnati, Ohio, where I currently live.
Hmm.
And I started grad school there. And like I started a PhD program in political science. And with that, there's a lot of reading. And so, like, there's a lot of reading, ton of writing, and like, it just didn't leave a lot of room for creativity. So so it was something I got burned out. I just put it away for a long time. And then, yeah, but what really got me, like, I guess in terms of if we want to talk about inspirations for the writing that I've done more recently, um, a lot of that actually comes from podcasting, which is funny. So, okay, so here's the thing. So I also have I have a podcast that I put on hold
Hmm.
because I'm writing. But so I had started a podcast. This was back in 2017, called Pot Stirrer Podcast, and it was basically about politics, religion, and history. And it was something that
Like
I had
and
started. Oh, go ahead.
somehow connected topics.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, so the thing is like I had gone for so I mentioned I'd gone to grad school
Yeah.
and I, went for political science, and what I focused on was on my dissertation was on was on US political behavior based on religious faith, and I specifically focused
That's
on
nice. That's nice.
yeah.
I have to say, that's
Well,
nice.
thank you. I specifically focused on white evangelical Christians.
Hmm.
And, this was back in, I earned my degree in 2012. And so this was before a lot of the more recent things have happened in the US. So, so I gotten into that. But then after, during my PhD program, I started to realize that I didn't want to teach. And so so once I earned it, because my whole thing was like, I need to finish. So when I finished, I ended up going into the private sector. But then, but then later on, I decided to go into podcasting because I had, I started to have some health challenges. Like specifically, I thought I was losing my sight and I didn't know why. And so it was like this health scare. And at the time, I was like, I was working a 9 to 5. I didn't really have a lot going on. I would just, you know, work, come home, spend time with my husband, go to sleep, and then just the cycle would begin again. And there was just I felt like my life was kind of empty. And then once I started to have problems with my sight, that freaked me out, and I started to then question everything that I'd done, and where have I gone wrong? I'm like this is happening, and there's all these things I could have accomplished that I didn't, and so it was just a whole thing. But then there was something that told me well, okay, what can you do? And so at the time I was listening to podcasts because I couldn't really, I was having trouble seeing, so it was hard for me to play video games or watch TV or some of those things. So I would just listen to podcasts, and I found all these podcasts that were really cool, but then there wasn't anything that specifically focused on, say, both politics and religion, and at the time. And so at least I couldn't find one, and I was like, and then it just clicked in my head well, why don't you start one?
Hmm.
So I went ahead and I was like, let me go and get the equipment before I talk myself out of it. So I went on Amazon, I ordered a Blue Yeti. I downloaded Audacity. I just, very like bare bones, but I was like, I'm going to teach myself how to do this. And so, so I did that. And fortunately later on, they were able to figure out what was going on with my site. And so so that's something that, now that's, been taken care of. And now I'm, pretty much good. But, but that was a scary time. But like through that, I found this like love for, you know, like kind of share, like kind of democratizing information. So just, so putting information out there, and like sharing like like things about various issues, so on and so forth. Well, fast forward to the pandemic. Well, yeah, so fast forward to the pandemic and I was starting to get burned out.
Hmm.
And I was interviewing authors. And like so there's the like a number of authors who had, just like and these were both like nonfiction and fiction. And they were written about like different themes that were at least tangentially related to my podcast. And so I started to meet people who were writing fiction that was like that had like connections to the things that were important to them. And that began to inspire me.
Hmm.
Um, like I had, there were things that I had been dealing with that I hadn't had a chance to really like do anything with. Like I had, like so, like at the time, and so like I was dealing with things, and then like I saw people who were writing stories. Like so, for example, I remember read like and I always like to read like what people write before I talk to them. And so one person that I interviewed, her name was Emily English Medley, and she wrote a book called uh she wrote a book called From the Moon I Watched Her. And it was basically a story about that was more or less about deconstruction.
Hmm.
And it was a very heavy book. It was very good. And it was just based on things that she had experienced. And so that was one thing that inspired me to start thinking about, my story. The other thing is that I had another guest that had come on my podcast quite a bit. Her name is Allison K. Garcia, and she's written a number of books in like she started out in Latino Christian fiction, and then she then transitioned to LGBTQ fiction,
Oh.
Christian fiction. And so, which, was that's a story in and of itself. But, but I had interviewed her like during, like just kind of during that whole process. And she got her start in NaNoWriMo, so like National Novel Writing Month. Now, like the organization recently shut down, but like there's a whole thing with that. But but the actual contest, like the whole idea was like, okay, write 50,000 words of a novel in the month of November. And so, and that's something, I mean, you can do that whether, there's an organization or not. But it's a challenge. And so I was like, well, that sounds really cool. And I'd heard about it, but then, it's like, okay, well, why don't I try that? So I decided to go on hiatus from my podcast. And part of it was to recharge, but then part of it was to write.
Hmm.
And so that also inspired me to get back into it.
So it got a lot to unwrap here, uh, but it got the other way around. So it got instead of somehow getting your storytelling to start with your podcast, it's got somehow the other way around. Based on the stories that you have seen in your podcast, somehow you were motivated to do the writing. How are you building the podcast, Jay? Were you building it like a story, like when exposing something, you are exposing it as a story, or were you usually doing it episode by episode depending on the topic, or interview style when you had guests?
So it depends. Like, so most of the time, like my podcast was a solo podcast.
Mm-hmm.
And so I would choose a topic that was related to, that's, related to like politics, religion, history.
Mm-hmm.
And I would do some research on it. But like the way that I would do it was that within the podcast, I would talk about the issues that were present within what I was talking about, but I like to bring in like historical context. And so when I would talk about the historical context, it was within the framework of storytelling.
Mm-hmm.
So for example, I once did a podcast about the decline of Detroit,
Mm-hmm.
and I shared. I even I shared like a short story about like my own background, and I think I even had talked about like my father. Like my father had grown up in Detroit, and so like some of the things that he had gone through. Like he had gone through the Detroit riots of 1967,
Okay.
and so and there's a lot of story that comes with that, and so I would incorporate things like that. I would also, sometimes incorporate just like history and like getting into and with the history, like doing it in the form of a story, even even if I didn't have a personal anecdote,
Mm-hmm.
I would talk about things like in a like a structure. So like this is where we started. This is like what happened. This is how we ended up. Like very much like cause and effect.
Yeah, you kind of practice storytelling already. So I think you trained a lot. How many episodes have you done?
So I've done I want to say 109. Like I have to go back and look.
Wow. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So but yeah, again, like it's like I've come back to it, but even then like I've like taken some time off because of writing. But yeah, like at my peak, I was usually putting out like an episode, like either an episode a month or an episode every couple weeks.
Mm-hmm. Okay. You did a huge practice for the storytelling, I have to say, because that's not easy. Usually solo podcasting needs more preparation that you have in the interview style. So of course I do my research as well, but a huge chunk of my discussion is based on what the guest is putting into the discussion, or what is adding as details, and that's why I think solo is it's much harder. Jay, you mentioned your experience, or not your experience, but you mentioned deconstruction, and I think that's an important topic. What did faith look like for you in the early life?
So when I was growing up, I grew up in a home where, um, but basically my parents saw faith in different ways. So my dad grew up Catholic, but then as an adult, he dabbled in a number of different religions. Like he had dabbled a couple of times in Islam. He had been a like evangelical Christian. He had um, been into some other things. And so so he had just kind of dabbled in a lot of things. And his whole philosophy was take what you can and throw the rest away. So like that's the way he looked at like religion, philosophy, anything pretty much. My mom, on the other hand, she grew up Baptist, and she became what she would call a non-denominational Christian, which really the best way I can describe it is like black evangelical.
Mm-hmm.
And so basically she would always say like she would like I grew up with like she would say things like okay, I'm going to be raptured up to heaven, I don't know about the rest of you. So you know that was basically like the so I had that messaging, and then I was going to Catholic school at the same time, and Yeah,
That's
so
a nice
there's
combination. That's a really
yeah.
nice combination.
Exactly. So, so I had that going on, and then in high school, like my senior year of high school, I started to go to a hairdresser that like it was a husband and wife team who were evangelicals. And they would talk about God and, just and just in a really like inviting type of way. And I was like, I don't know, you know because at that point I would probably say I was like I wouldn't tell anybody, but I was probably functionally agnostic. That's
Mhm.
probably the best way I can describe it. And then when I went to college, I went when I went to Ohio State, I went pretty much not knowing anybody. Like I had graduated from like my high school graduating class was like it was 23 students. So, and most of them stayed in Michigan. And so I went to Ohio State. I didn't know anyone. My friends weren't there. The guy that I was dating at the time wasn't there. Like nobody was there. And I felt lonely. Like I felt isolated. And then I remember like just walking around campus and there was this group of people who came up to me and was like, well, and we're talking about like, do you want to know more about Jesus Christ? And so, and I'm just like, I had nothing else to do. I'm like, sure. And then but then, and it was like over time, like I, started to, like it was like, it was started to sound convincing to me. And it was like, okay, this is something that I, believe in everything. And I met friends that were also in the faith and I joined a campus ministry, and so these were all things that, um, so I got really involved with that. And I, went to a church. Like I started out in um, I started out in a mega church. And like it was a televangelist mega church. Like the pastor was like had a national TV show, and yeah. And so I got into that, and it was very like charismatic. So like a lot of like um people like, shouting and like, a lot of like spiritual warfare, speaking in tongues, like a lot of that kind of thing. And then, and then and then after that, I started go to a storefront church that was very similar in their, like in expression, but it was a small church instead of it being like this huge mega church. So for me, like faith was very much like, okay, if I believe things like hard enough, if I believe in God, if I trust God enough, then all these good things will happen in my life. And so it was very much that, I was I was very like sold on the whole thing. I put, kind of jumped in like head first. Like I was like really into it. Um, and, I remember it being to the point where, um, it would cause like friction even with my family, because at the time my dad was in, like he was involved in Islam, and so, so he's, so there's things that he's saying like as a Muslim, and I'm saying, these certain things as an evangelical Christian, and and so there's conflict there, which was kind of uncomfortable because my dad and I were really close, and
Mhm.
so, so that was tough. Um, it affected some of my other relationships, but I felt really strongly that, that what I believed was right. And so, so that there's that aspect. And then there was also the purity culture aspect as well. So like in evangelicalism, there's this whole thing of, and especially like at that point in time, there were a lot of books that came out about, how like men and women should be like towards each other, like in terms of like romantic relationships and things like that, and how to conduct yourself and, things like that. So at the time, there was a book that was really popular called I Kiss Dating Goodbye. And this was like early 2000s. And the whole premise of the book was that you're supposed to like what they call court instead of date. So in other words, like your parents and your parents and your church are supposed to basically like guide you and your, significant other, along the way of like your relationship. And the idea is that you're supposed to move towards marriage.
Hmm.
And so, so there were those ideas. The problem was is that even though I did have a group of friends in terms of like my campus ministry and church and stuff, there are still certain aspects in terms of like relationships where I did feel isolated and I didn't feel like I had a lot of options. And so a lot of that stuff I felt like, well, how does this even apply to me? So, so it was like so there were seeds of things happening then, but I still was just kind of bought into the whole thing and I just, ignored red flags and just like, okay, I'm just gonna keep going.
And what was the let's say the single event or the string of events that that somehow started the deconstruction?
So when like so it's hard to say because there were just there are a number of things like even then because I was in like the campus ministry that I was in um it it was predominantly Asian, which had like there was like a number of like so it was like kind of like minority on minority like prejudices and it's just it was a different kind of thing like it yeah it was very like weird.
I
um
have to say that somehow the church. So I had so many questions, but I forgot them on the way. But I have so many questions. So like you said, a TV preacher, which is incredible. Just to think about it now. Uh,
mhm.
and then a front store church. And I actually want to ask you: Are there are are also today still there this front store churches?
Like, are they still around or?
Yeah.
I mean, there are. I mean, there are like in various cities you'll see them, right?
Hmm.
There are churches that are like that. That particular one is no longer around.
Okay, no, no, but I'm
Yeah,
I'm talking about general
yeah,
if they're
yeah,
still around there.
yeah. Oh, yeah, yeah. Especially like in a lot of urban areas in the U.S. That's a big thing.
Okay.
Yeah. So, um, yeah, like you'll see them. Yeah, you'll see them in a lot of urban areas. A lot of times, like you'll have like these church plants. And they'll start in a storefront because there are, especially in urban areas with, a lot of like decline of cities, like there are a lot of them available. So, you
Exactly.
know,
Yeah.
yeah,
And they're
yeah.
not
So,
that expensive as a big church.
right, exactly. Yeah. And now, like what you see more, well, what you see more of now, even more than the storefront churches are like old like warehouses that are being repurposed into churches because
Okay.
you have a lot of like these factories that have closed down and
Mm-hmm.
these buildings that these big buildings that have just been sitting and you'll find church plants or whatever that like people who decide to just start a church or like there'll be a bigger church that decides to start a smaller church and they'll just get a warehouse and start one.
Okay. I mean, it makes sense with the warehouses. It makes sense because at the end you are using an unused space, and I think okay that cannot harm. But the storefronts are for me still. I,
Mhm.
okay, I'm sorry for interrupting you.
Oh, no, no,
You were talking
it's
about
fine.
your university
It's fine.
campus.
Yeah, yeah, it's fine. So like when so when I, so I went, like, so I, so I had that experience. So, there were little seeds, but it was just like, okay, and I rationalized it by saying like, okay, I'm going to be a bridge builder and, like I'm going to like, because I do try to see things from different points of view, which is something that helped me a lot when I was teaching. Like I like to, even though I might have strong opinions on one thing or another, or, various issues, I like to be able to see like just different, different points of view and, like and empathize with other people,
Hmm.
essentially. And so. And I think it's something that I got from my dad, because my dad had a lot of friends from different countries and just different walks of life. And so, he was able to get along with so many different types of people. And so that was something that I grew up seeing, and it's something that I really admired about him. And so that's something that, I mean, I don't know if I wouldn't say I'm as great at the social stuff as he was, but but that idea of trying to connect with other people and understand, just different types of people, something that I kept with me. So, but the downside of that is that it's like being in evangelicalism is that I kind of ignored a lot of red flags. And so, I was just like, well, people see things differently, this, that, and the other. It's fine.
It's somehow the
And
definition of religion. You have to believe and not question it. So,
yeah. And that was part of the issue, is that like I'm the kind of person where I have questions. I'm always like a curious person. I like to learn more. I like to dig in. And that's not compatible with, like, especially like like that high control type of religion. It's not compatible with that. So that was a challenge. But I would say that going like kind of fast forwarding, like I guess the straw that broke the camel's back didn't come till a lot later.
mhm.
So, um, so my dad passed away when I was 25. And after that, so I was mid late 20s, I had a family member who came out as a lesbian.
Mm.
And at that point, I was at the point where, I, was accepting of people who were LGBTQ. I come to that point myself. Um, and a lot of it was just that I like a lot of the anti-gay and like the homophobia, transphobia and stuff like that the within evangelicalism, like like it was never compatible with me, with me as like being an empathetic person. And it was always something that I wrestled a lot with. And then I came to a point in my own journey where I was just like, this is stupid, but my last straw was like, having a family member come out, and like it became like there was like this conflict between her coming out and with the more conservative members of my family. And my thought was like, well, if the fruit, like, because they always talk about in evangelicalism the idea of like bearing of like the things that you do, like what kind of fruit does it bear? And like, is it good fruit? Like, in other words, are there positive outcomes or are there negative outcomes?
Mhm.
And I looked at this, I'm like, if this is like the fruit that this belief system brings forth, then I don't want any part of this.
But it's somehow this homophobia, because we have to call it homophobia. This
Mhm.
hate that exists there. It should
Yeah.
never exist in any kind of religion because it's against the natural definition of love. Love the person. Love your. I don't know in the English term, but love the person who's close to you. Love the one around you, and not hate anyone. And independent of what they are loving and what they are not loving and what they are preferring or not. And I think that should be the biggest red flag for everyone when they are coming out saying that we should hate them and we should, I don't know, kill them or whatever we should do. This is unbelievable for me. This is not
Yeah.
something that any kind of loving religion should do.
Yeah. Oh, I agree, and that's the thing, like there's a lot of like mental gymnastics that come with, that come with that belief system, like this, that like they tell you like love that, like love the sinner, hate the sin, just these different things that they tell you to
But not in this
try to
case.
justify it.
But not in
Hmm.
this case. Yeah.
Right. And that, and yeah, this, yeah, and you know, I just like, yeah, and seeing that happen, I was just like, like, nah,
Oh.
like I couldn't do it.
Yeah. Jay, to come back up to your book, I'm always interested about this, about the religious or the deconstruction of the religious belief, because I was myself a believer, raised an Orthodox Christian, and of course the red flags are always there and the questions are always there, but you're afraid to ask them first, and you think, "Ma, but I cannot be the only one seeing that. The others have to see it as well," and they would have said, "Most for sure I see something wrong." But then you realize more and more that you might have the right questions. But I would like to come back to the book. You said you did as a challenge, as starting as a challenge. Let's say it like this. Um, and The question is, what was first there? Was Anne the character, or was the setting of Losanti?
Um, the character, I would say, came first. I would say her story came first.
Mm-hmm.
Her like her main story. Well, okay, so her main story came first because my I guess what really got me to writing that story was um dealing with some things in my life. So when like so so when I was born, like my parents got divorced, like basically right after I was born. And my dad remarried when I was two. And so, like, when I talk about like my parents, I'm referring to my dad and, and his subsequent wife, like like technically my stepmother, but for all intents and purposes, I consider her my mom.
Hmm. Okay, that's nice.
Yeah. And so, like, like to this day, like she's my mom. And so that's how I grew up. But then my birth mother, like my birth mother was absent growing up. Like she wasn't there. I didn't know her. The only the only thing, like, so my parents would tell me that I had this birth mother that was out there, like that she existed. But the only thing that I had of her was like pictures of her, like just, these pictures of her. And I had a lot of feelings about that growing up. I wondered like, oh, especially as as I went into like becoming a teenager and, all of that, I was like, well, what happened? And, you know, like, how can you like have a kid and just disappear? Like that was the big thing. Um,
I'm still asking myself that, and I'm a father. I'm not a mother.
mhm. Yeah. And so, like that was always like my question. And, you know, um, and then when my dad died, then all of a sudden people started to talk. So up until that point, I had heard that like my birth mother had had some issues, and she felt that my dad was the better one to raise me, and that was always the story. And then when my dad passed away, then I started to hear from relatives, oh, well, there's more to it than that. Like, well, she didn't leave willingly, this, that, and the other happened, or, and so there are these other stories like that I was hearing, and I'm like, well, like, and at first I'm very defensive because like I think I mentioned earlier, like my dad and I were really close. And so I'm like, well, he said X, Y, and Z, so like these other stories, like they like that doesn't make sense. I just kind of shut it out. And I just didn't deal with it. And then like maybe about 2 or 3 years later, I got an email from my older sister. So like my birth mother had two other well actually three other children before she and my dad got married. Like so she had been in a previous marriage. And so when they got divorced and my birth mother was no longer in my life, she was still raising her other kids. And so one of them reached out to me, and then also like a cousin on that side of my family reached out. And so I got this email from my sister that like and I'd never met her either. Like I just seen like pictures of her as a teenager. And so, so but like I knew who she was when she reached out because I'd heard about her, but I'd never met her. And so, she's like, and I'm like, well, how did you find me? That kind of thing. And so, so she's like, yeah, like, I found you on Facebook and she's like, I could tell it was, that it was the right person because I mean, my maiden name was like really common, like super common. And so, but at the same time, like, but she's like, I could tell because, like being a black girl with red hair is not very common. And so just, put the pieces together like that and, all that. So, you know, so my big question to her, so, she was telling about what's going on with family and, and I asked, like, the big question I had was like, well, does my birth mother actually want to meet me? And so she's like, yes. And so so I did have a chance to meet her. And over that next decade, she and I like like basically built a relationship. It was like I wouldn't say it was this like fantastical like mother daughter like oh we're making up for lost time all that kind of stuff. Like it wasn't like that, but it was a relationship. You know, And then right like the December before COVID, she passed away. And yeah, and so,
I'm so sorry. I,
it yeah. So, but at first I didn't know how to deal with it.
I
Um, it was one thing, like losing my dad was one thing because, again, like he and I were really close. Like, he had been in my life for all my life up until that point. That type of grief was one thing. But then when I lost my birth mother, I didn't know how to process that at all
Mhm.
because I didn't know if it was I was missing her or was I sad about what might have been. And like I didn't have and then I ended up not really having time to deal with it because then COVID happened. And like when the pandemic happened, like I started working from home, so I wasn't like so I wasn't on the front lines or anything, but both my husband and my mom are both in healthcare. And so so they're, like they're both on the front lines of the thing. And, that was, so I was focused more on like, I had to deal with anxiety. So like my anxiety was like through the roof, just thinking about them and thinking about like other like friends and family. And, so I just didn't have the mental space to deal with the grief. And
Mhm.
so I just kind of put it on a shelf. And then fast forward to like that point when, I was like when like I was telling you about doing the podcast and talking to these authors, and I was burning out, but I think part of the reason I was burning out was because of this like unresolved grief.
Mhm.
And so being able to write, that helped me to start working through the grief. you know, Even though like it's a fictional story, the idea for me was to like I wanted to write a story, the kind of story that I wish I had when
Mhm.
I was that age.
How did the writing help you to deal with the grief? Or I want to ask you maybe a different way. Did you, through writing, decided if it's going to be a grief or not?
I guess at first I didn't. I guess I didn't. I don't know if I thought of it in that way, like at first. So I started out just writing, like right, like kind of writing this overarching, like this story about just this woman who is confronted with
Uh-huh.
with the reasons for her birth mother's absence after her father passes away. So that was sort of like the what I was looking at. I wasn't exactly sure where I was going with it at first.
Uh-huh.
I knew that I mean, because it was definitely going like I knew it was going to definitely going to be fictionalized, but I wanted to kind of encapsulate some of the feelings that I had, and kind of in a way work through some of the feelings that I had through Anne and her trajectory. So it started like I started out with just kind of creating like Anne's story, like what is her normal?
Uh-huh.
And then because I didn't write in order, like I wrote like in scenes, so like just throughout the book. So I kind of started out with like, okay, what does her life look like normally? And so that's how I got into like college, and and I got into like some of her backstory, through like her discussions with her therapist, and the idea was like so it just started out with like kind of getting into like what does her life look like, but then it was like as I was writing that I started to realize how much of that of like some of the things that she had dealt with were outgrowths of not having her birth mother in her life, and realizing that like some of the things that I also went through, because there are some things that she went through that kind of mirrored some of the things I had gone through in my life. Some of them are not so much, but the idea was that either way, like I was working through, like I was started to gain, I guess, a level of self-awareness and it's not for me, it's not about like blame. It's just about being aware. So like in just, having like if I know, then that's something I can work through.
Uh-huh. So basically, deciding,
Yeah.
not really deciding, but discovering what exactly is the direction that you want to take that would help you.
Yeah, I think that's yeah, I would say that yeah, it's more about discovering, figuring that out, working that like kind of working through the narrative, working through the story, and just realizing like okay, these other issues, like tie back to some of the things that maybe I was feeling not having my birth mother in my life,
Uh-huh.
and just like how I felt about myself, and just maybe like the different ways that manifested. And so that's how I started it. And so I kind of got into that, but then I didn't write as much about her, like about Stephanie, like Anne's birth mother. I didn't really write as much about her, and then about kind of where that went until like towards the end.
Uh-huh.
And I left a lot of that to the end because I think at that point I felt more ready to really delve into that, because I feel like that was probably like at least for myself, that was like where probably the biggest like pain points were for myself.
Was the writing more cathartic or was challenging?
I would say cathartic.
Okay.
Definitely cathartic. Um, yeah, like I like that's probably like the biggest way, like yeah, because like I would, it was like I felt like like once I really got into it, there was like a flow, but then there was also like the feelings came back, and it was like, and I actually started to feel feelings that I hadn't really like allowed myself to feel.
Uh-huh.
And so it got to where by the time I was finally done, because I had like so I'd written for NaNoWriMo, I'd gotten to 50,000 words, but then I put it away and then I came back to it. And so when I came back to it and I finally finished it, by the time I was able to finish it, I was finally at the point where I felt like I could grieve my birth mother for the relationship that we had, for who she was, and like missing her for, missing her as a person.
As the writing process was kind of a independent process, I would call it like this. Did you have a moment when a character said something that surprised you?
Where I'm sorry?
Where one of the characters said something that you haven't planned before that surprised you?
I'm sure. I think yeah, I'm sure. I think especially like I think especially came through like I think especially came through like where like Anne's relationship with Luke.
Hmm.
There was a lot there where like you know like just seeing where that went, because I kind of just let that kind of be like kind of see where that went, and you know and yeah, that, yeah, her finding her, like beginning to find her voice, like that was a big thing
Hmm.
for sure.
So you said you came back to the story to finish it. Did
Yes.
the second part came directly after it?
The second part, okay, so I wrote the first 50,000 in like November of 2022. Then in the next NaNoWriMo in November 2023, I
Ah,
started writing the second book.
okay.
And I actually finished the first manuscript of the second book before I came back to the first one.
Okay.
Yeah.
Interesting. Because somehow the story was complete when you finished the second part, I do guess.
Yes.
Yeah. Cool. Um,
Yeah.
sounds like a cool experience. What was the no what how did the decision process went into going into self-publishing, Jay?
So a couple of things, like there were a couple of things that kind of that went into that. Um, so like I did, like so I invest, like I'm if I get into anything, the thing about me is that if I get into anything, I tend to research it to death. Like that's just how I am. Like I just like will research the heck out of it. And so I looked into like, okay, traditional publishing, self-publishing, and like, like some of it, like a lot of it was like, okay, if I traditionally publish, then I mean, if it gains traction, then that's like awesome. You can be on a New York Times bestseller. Like there's a lot of good things about trad pub. But like with self-publishing, I and I think especially with Make Me Free, I really wanted control over my story. Like that was a big thing for me, because like that was like it's such a personal story for me that I didn't like that I didn't want to take the chance of, say, like, if I did get get an agent and then get like a publishing house to buy the manuscript.
Hmm.
I didn't want it to be something to where they buy it and then it never sees the light of day. I wanted to be able to, to put that out there and to, to have creative control over that. So that was a big thing for me. And then in general, I also wanted to bet on myself.
Hmm.
Um, so so I ended up starting like, basically I'm a sole proprietor, but like I registered my company name, and the company name is called Tartanium Press, which is like the name Tartanium comes from, like, my dad had a nonprofit back when he was alive that was like, it was like his baby, so so he was a psychologist, but then on the side he had this nonprofit that gave like that was designed to provide low cost to free like medical care, like simple medical care for people who were low income.
Hmm.
And so, and he was able to, like, he had a lot of friends that were physicians. And so he was able to, contract with them and, and the idea was to, it was to provide, basic care for people in the community. And so, um, so that was something that was his thing. And then, but then when he died, like like the rest of us didn't have the same kind of like know-how or connection or anything like that to keep that going. But the name, like, but I decided that, like, I wanted to, I wanted to start something, but I wasn't sure what I was going to name it. And then, like, but then it was like, okay, that, like, I was talking to my siblings, like, I was talking to my siblings, like, well, so I have like two siblings that I grew up with. And so, we're talking and they're like, well, what about Tartanium? And I'm like, well, you know, actually, maybe so, because it's like basically like, because and I think it comes from even like when it Make Me Free, like there's the like so Anne's father Marshall even talks about this idea of like, take what you can and throw the rest away, you
Hmm.
know? And so like just this idea of like, okay, there's all this knowledge out there, there's all this stuff out here, there's so much that you can take from different avenues and, and you can kind of create your own thing. And so that's how, like, so I was like, okay, that makes sense. And it's in a way, in a sense, it's like, it is in a different vein, but in a way, it's carrying my father's legacy.
Makes sense. Makes sense that you wanted to have the story in your hands, and I think that's again the most important thing is that you want to have it as your story, not someone else's story that could be selling 1 million copies, but it's not your story anymore.
Hmm.
That's always something I think it makes. I appreciate the courage. Absolutely.
Thanks.
Um, what were you the most afraid of when putting Make Me Free into the world?
Mm. I think that I worried about perhaps upsetting the people that I was closest to.
Hmm, that's an
Because,
interesting one.
yeah, and I think and it's because, like, again, like even though it's fiction, it's also like it's coming from like a kind of a very it's coming from a very honest place.
Hmm.
And I and through it I was like walking through a number of issues and a number of things that I could see, being like maybe misunderstood.
Hmm.
And I think that the big thing for me was that I had to be at a point where I felt comfortable with putting it out there and, living with the consequences. And, like that's the best way I can put that, and a lot of that is like, okay, I had to be like comfortable with like, okay, this is my story and, you know, this is my voice and it is what it is.
Correct. Absolutely correct. And at the end, nobody has to take anything personally. It's just your take on the story, and it's your story.
Right.
You said that writing, or you said you indirectly said that writing this story somehow made you reclaim parts of yourself you didn't know you had or you had lost. I would try to put it like this. Um, you said that you surprised yourself while writing it with some actions of the main character, with some events that happened. Um, but you set your story in the in Losanti,
Hmm.
Ohio. Um, what does that place represent for you?
So, like Lisanti is I started out with creating Lisanti as like almost a stand-in for Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
Like the word like so the word Lisanti, like the name Lisanti itself comes from the city of Cincinnati, Ohio. The original name for it was Lisantiville.
Okay. So
Yeah.
it's a love letter to Cincinnati.
Yeah, so it is, but it's like it's not like a one for one of
Mm-hmm.
Cincinnati. There are things about Lisanti that if like people who are from Cincinnati or who are familiar with Cincinnati could pick out and say like that reminds me a lot of Cincinnati.
Mm-hmm.
But there are other aspects that are different, and I wanted to have that flexibility to like I didn't want to be like tied to a specific location when it came to Lisanti specifically, because there are things I wanted to do with the characters that may not necessarily be possible in the real Cincinnati. But that said, like Cincinnati can be like not Cincinnati, I'm sorry, Lisanti can be a stand-in for a number of like say everyman cities or like mid-sized cities, just like and like almost like any town in America.
Mm-hmm.
Um, Lisanti like represents like the type of place where you a lot of like you're born there, you die there, but in the in between, like you kind of go away and figure yourself out or whatever the case might be, and then you may end up coming back. It's like I put it in Make Me Free. I put it as Lisanti is a boomerang town.
Mm-hmm.
And so like it's just like this idea of like these places that um we we come from and then at some point we end up back there. Um like even though like I have like Detroit for example like I have Detroit in my book as Detroit. Detroit is also kind of like that too. Where it is also so it has that boomerang quality to it where a lot of times like people might be from there and they might like they end up coming back like my dad did that like he's fr like he grew up in Detroit. We left for a while like he actually like before I was even born he had spent a long time away from Detroit. And eventually like when he got older and wanted to settle down he came back to Detroit.
Is that sense of community that pulls you back?
It's a sense of like I would say community, familiarity
Mm-hmm.
is a big thing. Um, yeah, like familiarity, community. Um, I think that it's a lot of times it's those things. Like just like going back to what you know.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and yeah, I mean, I think when you look at like when you look at like cer at So it Make Me Free, like, so Anne leaves Michigan, she goes to Lisanti, and for her, it's a different experience because she's an outsider in a community like that.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think there is like the aspect of like if you're like so you have those types of places where if you're from those places, okay, it's a nice place of familiarity to come back to. But if you're not from those places, then it can be isolating and you have to figure out where you fit.
Mm.
And that can be a challenge. And so that's one of the things about Anne being an outsider coming into that type of place and having to find where she belongs, and the type of challenge that is. And that was something that I wanted to reflect there, like because I like Cincinnati, like Cincinnati is also like very much like a boomerang town. Like I would actually say, Cincinnati is Detroit with hills. Like it really is, you know. Um, yeah, because I mean Cincinnati, like I mean they didn't have like the auto industry, but they had like steel and they had like factories and things, and a lot of that kind of stuff left, and you had like basically the old husks of factories and stuff in their place, and they had to kind of remake themselves, and so. so there is that aspect. There's also the aspect of like people who are, they're from Cincinnati, they grow up here, they leave, and then they eventually come back.
Mm-hmm.
And so there is that aspect of it. But then if you're not from that type of a place, like if you're not from that place and you're coming into it, then where like then it can be it can be a challenge. And so like when I first like I moved here for grad school and I only knew the people that I was in grad school with, and we were all almost all of us were transplants. And so, so there was, so there's that aspect. And then I ended up like actually like leaving briefly after my dad died, and I had no intention of ever coming back. So, I was just like, okay, I'm, going back to Detroit, I'll figure out what's going to happen from there. And, there is that theme again of like leaving and coming back, and I came back to be closer to my family. And so there's like the aspect of leave, but then I had no intention of coming back to Cincinnati. But, life happens and I ended up back in Cincinnati. And it worked out okay because I still had some friends that I did make a few friends here the first time I was here, and I was able to keep in touch with a lot of them. And so when I came back, a lot of them were still there and, we were able to reconnect and,
Mm-hmm.
and then I was able to build on that over time and like find, I found like communities of like people who have similar interests and things like that. Like I had to make an effort, but they're out there, And so now I have like, people, I have people around me and, this is I'm married, like my husband's a native Cincinnatian. So, so I will probably never leave, but that's okay.
Nice. So if someone wants to find out if Anne will ever leave Los Anti May the 6th, to die is gain. Um, Jay, you are an author, officially an author. How has your sense of purpose changed since becoming an author?
That's a good question. I think it's hard to say. Like, so basically, like at this point, like, so I don't know. It's such an interesting experience, like being an author, like just because I I guess I hadn't thought about how it would change things. Like, so for example, like yesterday, I went to, like, we have an independent bookstore
Mm-hmm.
called Joseph Beth that is like, it's the biggest independent bookstore in Cincinnati. Like, people will go there before they go to like Barnes and Noble or any place like that.
Nice.
Yeah. And so they, like I was actually surprised that like I'd reached out to them and asked them about carrying my book and I had no expectation that they would because they're such a big place, right? Like they do like they sponsor like our book related events in the city, like so it was just shot in the dark and then they agreed to carry my book. And so I like yesterday I went up there and it was a surreal experience actually seeing it. Like just, and it was like right there on the shelves, just right there. And so, seeing like Make Me Free, like right there. And it's like, wow. So I guess like so it's one thing I think being a podcaster and just putting my thoughts out there. But it's another thing to have something that I wrote, and I mean, I have a dissertation as well, but like that's different, like that's in an academic kind of thing. Like it's in an academic database. Like nobody's gonna see it unless they're like really dying to find information about like evangelicals and back in the early 2000s. So you know. But the thing is that like see, like actually like writing something that is for mass consumption, it's on one hand, like it's an amazing feeling, but then there's also a level of responsibility that goes with that because, I think of like, okay, you know, what am I putting out there? And like, I'm, and I guess my thought is that I want to, like, I want for the kinds of stories to be out there that, I like, that I wish I had. I also like the idea of like, especially with in the former evangelical space, like, ex-evangelicals. Um, there's a lot there are people out there writing stories, and most of it is in nonfiction, but to have like fiction stories that can also resonate with people who are questioning,
Hmm.
people who are trying to figure things out when it comes to their faith, people who might be considering leaving it or having it maybe even look different. You know, I wanted to like I think it's cool to kind of have something out there that is something for them. And so it has helped me to, I guess, in terms of how I see myself, it's in how I relate to people and things like that. Um, it makes me want to, put more out there.
Hmm. That's a nice feeling. That means you enjoy it, and
Oh yeah.
and that's something which is really cool. Do you feel more pressure or do you feel more freedom?
Uh, there's a level of pressure because as you put things out there and you build an audience, they're going to want more, right? So there is that aspect. There's also the aspect of like, okay, there's always going to be people who, okay, I liked your earlier things. I don't know about these new things, so, how much are they going to like, say, whatever I put out there that's next, right? But at the same time, it's also a challenge, and it's an exciting challenge for me. you know like what else can I put out there, like how, like what other like ideas can I play with and come up with.
What's that one thing that you know now that you wish you knew before you write the first book?
That's a good question. Well, I don't know if it would have made a difference, but I think the one thing I didn't realize is how much work it is. Because like, and it's not the writing, like that's the thing, it's really not, it's not the writing, it's everything that comes after. Especially like when you're like when if you're self-publishing. Although even I've talked to people who traditionally publish, and there's a lot that they have to do as well. But there's like it's like you're not just like writing, you're also marketing, you're also like you're doing a lot of interacting with other people. You have to sell yourself, you have to sell what you're writing. Like there's a lot of like that aspect. There's like little things here and there, like like I have like an in-person like event coming up in a few weeks, and it's like I have to get like materials for it. And so like oh, like I need to get bookmarks. Where do I get bookmarks? Just little things. It can be big things, it can be little things, and that kind of thing. Like part of me wishes I knew that beforehand, but then again, though, it might be for the best that I didn't know.
The question is, would you have started still if you have knew that? We don't know.
I mean, I would hope that I would have still done it.
Ah,
Because I
okay.
mean, I don't, because the thing is, I don't regret it. Like, I'm glad that I'm doing it. Um, yeah. And I guess the way I look at it is sort of similar to the way I looked at it when I first started podcasting.
Hmm.
Like, let me jump into this before I talk myself out of it.
Now it's too late for both of them. Now it's too late for both of them.
Exactly. I'm in now.
What's one piece of advice that you would give to someone that wants to take the same step as you, Jay?
Honestly,
Do it
like,
before you
yeah,
convince yourself out of
yeah,
it.
exactly. Like, just do it. Like, just do it. Bet on yourself.
That's the best piece of advice, and I think this would just do it. It's exactly the right thing. Talking about work, you said before, and before I started this, I always thought, "Well, come on, it cannot be that complicated. You just do it. You do the interview, do a bit of preparation." But man, it's a hell of a work. So it's
For sure, for
yeah,
sure. Like, yeah, yeah, podcasting, yeah, there's a lot of work involved, and then, if you're interviewing people, like there's a lot that goes into that as well. Like, just researching that and, then coming up with questions and making sure that, you have something that flows and that, that you're able to engage the listener and, there's so much that goes into that and,
yeah.
yeah. That's
What's next for you, Jay?
so what's next for me is, well, at least like this summer, I have at least a couple of in-person events that are scheduled. I'm also working on a short story collection.
Mm-hmm.
And that's something that I'm going to provide that like free for people who sign up for my newsletter, which you can sign up for online. So anyone who is already subscribed and then who decides to subscribe at a later date, that's some like you'll get like a short story collection. So that's something I'm working on right now.
I will
And
link you will link your website and all your socials in the show notes caption below, independent of where someone is watching this. Sorry for interrupting you.
oh no, you're good. You're good. So, but yeah, so that's like my next thing at the moment. And then I have some other ideas that I'm kind of playing with at like in terms of like a longer like a longer like series. So, but we'll see what happens.
Jay, it this discussion was delightful for me. I loved it. I love to find out more about Detroit, and about Cincinnati, and about your writing style, and about you. The most important. Before we wrap it up, I usually have my rapid fire questions,
Okay.
which I like to, they are tailored for every guest. Uh, One word to describe your writing process, Jay.
Improv.
Oh, nice. Nice, I like it. Improv is my middle name. The evangelical upbringing in one sentence.
Control.
Ah, it's hard. That's hard. Yeah. Um, Most unexpected source of inspiration.
Hmm. Hmm. This is going to sound strange, but BBW parties.
Okay, that's
Hmm. Yeah, it'll make sense if you read the book.
uh, that's the most
Yeah.
important. Yeah,
Yes.
for whomever is gonna win it.
Yeah. For any readers, yeah. That's yeah.
Um, if your life were a novel, what would the title be?
A journey to self-awareness.
Write at sunrise or burn the midnight oil?
Burn the midnight oil.
I could have betted on that. Jay, where do you feel the most at home, in life or in words?
Hmm. Uh, Probably in words.
Jay, thank you so much. Uh, Thank you so much for the talk. Thanks so much for getting me to know you, and thank you for doing this giveaway together.
Thanks so much, Paul, for having me. I really enjoyed our conversation. This was awesome.
That was awesome for me as well, and I hope we can do this again. Either way, after you write your short stories or after the next book, I would be happy to.
That'll be awesome. I'd appreciate it.
I appreciate it a lot. I'm an email away. Jay, thanks so
Awesome.
much. See you next time.